Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases registered in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you are watching us and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1846, Savannah's cotton plantations stretched along the Ogeechee River like white scars across the Georgia landscape. The Whitmore estate occupied nearly 3,000 acres of fertile ground, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like burial shrouds. It was here, in the servants' quarters behind the main house, that something began which would challenge everything the community believed about human nature itself. The plantation records, discovered in 1868 during the demolition of the old overseer's cabin, contained entries that defied explanation. Among inventories of livestock and harvest yields, someone had written in careful script about meals that satisfied in ways no ordinary food could manage. The handwriting belonged to Marcus Whitmore, the plantation's youngest son, though he would deny this until his death in 1892. Aurelia Thompson arrived at Whitmore Estate in late spring of 1846. The bill of sale, archived in the Chatham County records, listed her age as 22 years, with notation of her exceptional skill in food preparation. What the document failed to mention was the peculiar circumstances of her previous employment. 3 different households in Charleston had released her services within 18 months, each citing only that her cooking had become unsuitable for their family's needs. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the plantation mistress, had been suffering from what the family physician described as melancholia following the loss of her infant daughter the previous winter. She rarely left her chambers and consumed little more than weak broth and dry biscuits. The existing kitchen staff, led by an elderly woman named Bessie, had proven incapable of preparing anything that would tempt Mrs. Whitmore's diminished appetite. Aurelia's quarters were located in the row of cabins furthest from the main house, near the edge of the swamp, where the property bordered wild, unclaimed land. Neighbors would later recall that smoke rose from her chimney at unusual hours, sometimes in the depth of night, when cooking fires should have been long extinguished. The smoke carried an aroma that was both appetizing and somehow unsettling, though none could adequately describe what made it so disturbing. Within days of Aurelia's arrival, Mrs. Whitmore began taking regular meals again. She requested dishes prepared specifically by the new cook, claiming they possessed restorative qualities, unlike anything she had previously tasted. The meat was always perfectly seasoned and remarkably tender, though its exact nature remained unclear. When questioned, Aurelia would only say it came from wild game she trapped in the swamp during her free hours. The other household staff noticed changes in Mrs. Whitmore's demeanor that extended beyond her renewed appetite. She became increasingly possessive of Aurelia's cooking, forbidding anyone else in the family from sampling the special meals. She would lock herself in the dining room during these private suppers, and the servants could hear her humming contentedly as she ate, a sound she had not made since before her child's death. Marcus Whitmore, then 19 years old, developed an intense curiosity about the mysterious cook. His personal journal, found decades later hidden behind loose boards in his bedroom wall, contained detailed observations of Aurelia's nocturnal activities. He wrote of following her into the swamp on moonless nights, watching as she disappeared into areas where even experienced hunters feared to venture. She would return before dawn, carrying cloth bundles that dripped dark stains onto the sandy path. The plantation's livestock began displaying strange behavior during this period. Cattle would refuse to graze in certain pastures, particularly those nearest to Aurelia's cabin. The horses became skittish when led past her quarters, and several valuable breeding sows were found dead with no apparent cause, their carcasses bearing unusual markings that the local veterinarian could not explain. Bessie, the head cook, attempted to discover the source of Aurelia's ingredients by searching her cabin while she was away. She found hanging in the rafters various cuts of meat in different stages of curing, but the flesh was unlike anything she had encountered in 40 years of kitchen work. The texture was too fine for pork, too pale for beef, and possessed a marbled quality that reminded her uncomfortably of something she could not quite identify. Other plantation workers began reporting disturbing dreams after the arrival of the new cook. They described visions of wandering through dark kitchens where shadowy figures prepared elaborate feasts, and the smell of cooking meat would linger in their nostrils long after waking. Several requested transfers to other properties, claiming they could no longer sleep peacefully while residing on the estate. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, was summoned to examine Mrs. Whitmore when her husband became concerned about her dramatic transformation. She had gained weight rapidly and displayed an almost manic energy that replaced her previous listlessness. During his examination, he noted an unusual odor clinging to her clothing and breath, something he described in his notes as reminiscent of iron, and something else he preferred not to name. Neighboring plantations reported an increase in runaway slaves during this period, though none could be traced to any specific property. The descriptions provided by those who glimpsed fleeing figures in the swamp were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some spoke of seeing people who appeared injured or distressed, stumbling through the marsh in the hours before dawn, but searches conducted by local authorities yielded no evidence of their passage. Marcus Whitmore's obsession with Aurelia intensified as summer progressed into autumn. His journal entries became increasingly erratic, filled with speculation about her true nature and the source of her culinary expertise. He wrote of confronting her directly on multiple occasions, demanding to know what she was feeding his mother, but claimed she would only smile and speak in riddles about nourishment that satisfied deeper hungers than ordinary food could address. The truth began to emerge in October, when a traveling merchant named Jonathan Reeves stopped at the plantation seeking shelter for the night. He was assigned quarters in the guest cabin, which afforded him a clear view of the kitchen gardens and servants' area. Unable to sleep due to the humidity and mosquitoes, he witnessed Aurelia emerging from the swamp in the early hours before dawn, dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas. Reeves later testified to local authorities that curiosity compelled him to investigate after Aurelia had returned to her cabin. Following the drag marks through the sandy soil, he discovered a disturbed area near the edge of the property where the earth had been recently excavated and hastily covered. His preliminary digging revealed fragments that caused him to immediately abandon his investigation and depart the plantation before sunrise, forgoing the hospitality he had been offered. The merchant's report to the county sheriff resulted in a formal investigation of the Whitmore estate. Deputies arrived on a grey November morning when fog from the river obscured much of the property. They were accompanied by Dr. Hartwell and Reverend Timothy Morrison from Savannah's First Presbyterian Church, both men having agreed to witness whatever might be discovered. Aurelia was questioned extensively about her cooking practices and the source of her ingredients. She maintained that everything she prepared came from legitimate sources, either purchased from local farmers or procured through her own hunting activities in the surrounding wilderness. When pressed about the unusual quality of the meat she served, she claimed to possess family recipes passed down through generations, techniques for preparation and seasoning that enhance the natural flavors of ordinary game. The search of her cabin revealed a collection of iron pots and cooking utensils that were notably well maintained despite their obvious age. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators discovered a leather-bound journal written in a combination of English and what appeared to be African dialect. Most disturbing were detailed drawings that accompanied the text, illustrations of preparation methods that seemed to focus on subjects other than traditional livestock or wild game. Whitmore was questioned about her recent dietary habits and the dramatic improvement in her health. She became increasingly agitated when asked to describe the meals prepared by Aurelia, insisting that she had simply been served well-prepared meat dishes that helped restore her appetite following her period of grief. She could not or would not specify what type of meat had been used, claiming only that it possessed exceptional nutritional qualities. The excavation of the disturbed area near the swamp yielded evidence that deeply troubled the investigating team. Buried in the sandy soil were remnants that suggested activities inconsistent with normal food preparation. Bone fragments were discovered that bore markings indicating careful butchering, but the size and character of these remains raised questions that none of the officials present wish to voice publicly. Dr. Hartwell's examination of the evidence led him to request consultation with colleagues from the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta. The fragments were transported under careful guard for more detailed analysis. The resulting report, filed with county authorities but never made public, contained findings that challenged conventional understanding of the case. Further investigation revealed that Aurelia's previous employment history contained significant gaps that had not been initially apparent. Records from Charleston indicated that she had worked for various households over several years, but witnesses who might have provided detailed testimony about her service had either moved away or could not be located for questioning. The case took an unexpected turn when 3 residents of neighboring properties came forward with information about unusual activity they had observed over the preceding months. Each reported seeing solitary figures walking toward the Whitmore estate during late evening hours, people who appeared to be responding to some form of summons or invitation. None of these individuals had been seen returning by the same route. Marcus Whitmore's journal provided the most disturbing insights into the true nature of Aurelia's activities. His final entries, written in increasingly unstable handwriting, described following her into the deepest parts of the swamp where she maintained what he termed a secondary kitchen. This crude outdoor facility contained equipment and supplies that suggested food preparation on a scale far exceeding the needs of a single plantation household. The young man's account included details about the process by which Aurelia selected and acquired her ingredients. According to his observations, she would venture into Savannah's poorer districts during market days, engaging in conversations with individuals who appeared desperate or vulnerable. She would offer them employment or temporary shelter, arrangements that invariably required them to accompany her to remote locations. When confronted with Marcus Whitmore's accusations, Aurelia maintained her innocence, but exhibited behavior that investigating officials found increasingly suspicious. She claimed that the young man's testimony was the product of an overactive imagination combined with unhealthy obsession. However, her explanations for the evidence discovered on the property became progressively less coherent as questioning continued. The investigation reached its climax when authorities decided to conduct a comprehensive search of the swamp areas where Aurelia claimed to hunt for wild game. Local hunters who knew the terrain were recruited to guide the search party through the treacherous marshland. What they discovered in a clearing approximately 2 miles from the main house defied all expectations and moral comprehension. The site contained the remains of a sophisticated operation designed for purposes that extended far beyond legitimate food preparation. Carefully constructed smokehouses and curing racks suggested activities that had been ongoing for considerable time. Most disturbing were the personal effects found scattered throughout the area, items that indicated the presence of multiple individuals whose ultimate fate remained unclear. Evidence suggested that Aurelia had been conducting her activities with the knowledge and perhaps cooperation of other household staff. Several servants were taken into custody for questioning, though most claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing. The investigation revealed a complex network of complicity and willful blindness that had allowed the situation to continue undetected for months. Mrs. Whitmore's condition deteriorated rapidly once her special meals were discontinued. She experienced what Dr. Hartwell described as severe withdrawal symptoms, including violent tremors, hallucinations, and an insatiable craving for the specific type of nourishment she had become accustomed to consuming. Her husband was forced to restrain her physically to prevent her from attempting to locate Aurelia's remaining supply of prepared ingredients. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with unusual secrecy due to the sensitive nature of the evidence. Aurelia was charged with multiple crimes, though the specific accusations were never made public. The trial was moved to Augusta to avoid the intense local interest and potential for civil unrest that the case had generated in Savannah. During her trial, Aurelia's defense attorney attempted to argue that she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control, a woman trapped by traditions and practices inherited from her ancestors. He claimed that she had been compelled to continue activities that she understood to be wrong, but felt powerless to resist due to cultural and spiritual obligations. The prosecution presented evidence that painted a far different picture of deliberate predatory behavior designed to satisfy both her own psychological needs and the perverted appetites she had cultivated in her employers. They argued that her actions demonstrated calculated cruelty and a complete disregard for human dignity and life. Witnesses testified about the transformation they had observed in Mrs. Whitmore's behavior and appearance during the period of Aurelia's employment. Several described her as having become almost unrecognizable, displaying an enthusiasm for her special meals that bordered on obsession. The relationship between cook and mistress had evolved into something that transcended normal household arrangements. Marcus Whitmore's testimony provided the most damning evidence against Aurelia. His detailed account of her nocturnal activities and the systematic way she had identified and approached potential victims demonstrated a level of premeditation that shocked even experienced court observers. His journal entries were read aloud, creating an atmosphere of horror that pervaded the courtroom. The defense attempted to discredit Marcus's testimony by questioning his mental stability and suggesting that his obsession with Aurelia had led him to fabricate or exaggerate his observations. They pointed out that he had waited months before reporting his suspicions to authorities, arguing that a truly concerned individual would have acted more quickly. Medical testimony regarding the physical evidence discovered on the plantation proved particularly disturbing to the jury. Dr. Hartwell and his colleagues described their findings in clinical terms, but the implications of their analysis were unmistakable. The scale and systematic nature of the operation suggested activities that extended far beyond isolated incidents. Several witnesses came forward to testify about missing persons in the Savannah area during the period of Aurelia's employment. While no direct connection could be established between these disappearances and activities at the plantation, the timing and circumstances created a pattern that prosecution attorneys argued was too significant to ignore. The trial revealed details about Aurelia's background that had not been previously known. She had been born on a plantation in South Carolina, where similar unexplained events had occurred during her childhood. Witnesses testified that practices involving food preparation and consumption that violated normal moral boundaries had been present in her family for generations. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that Aurelia was continuing traditions that she had been taught were acceptable within her cultural context. They claimed that she had not understood the moral and legal implications of her actions, having been raised in an environment where such practices were normalized and even encouraged. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence of Aurelia's intelligence and sophistication, arguing that she fully understood the nature of her activities and had deliberately concealed them because she knew they were wrong. They pointed to her elaborate deceptions and the careful way she had managed to avoid detection for months as proof of her culpability. Mrs. Whitmore was called to testify about her experiences during the period when she consumed the meals prepared by Aurelia. Her testimony was halting and often incoherent as she struggled to describe sensations and experiences that seemed to defy normal language. She admitted to feeling an intense craving for the special meals that surpassed any appetite she had previously experienced. The trial concluded after 3 weeks of testimony that left participants and observers deeply disturbed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Aurelia to death, citing the particularly heinous nature of her crimes and the threat she posed to civilized society. Appeals filed on Aurelia's behalf argued that the evidence against her was largely circumstantial, and that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that specific crimes had been committed. They claimed that the rush to judgment had been motivated more by hysteria and prejudice than by facts presented during the trial. The appeals were unsuccessful, and Aurelia's execution was scheduled for March of 1847. However, she died in her cell 2 weeks before the appointed date, apparently from natural causes, though some officials privately expressed suspicion about the circumstances of her death. The Whitmore family abandoned their plantation following the conclusion of the trial. Mrs. Whitmore required extended medical treatment for what physicians described as a form of addiction they had never previously encountered. She never fully recovered from her experiences and died in 1851 in a private sanitarium near Charleston. Marcus Whitmore left Georgia permanently after testifying at the trial. He moved to California during the gold rush and was never known to discuss his experiences at the family plantation. His journal remained hidden in his former bedroom until the house was demolished in 1898, when construction workers discovered it purely by accident. The plantation house stood empty for several years after the family's departure. Local residents reported strange occurrences on the property, including unexplained smoke rising from the abandoned kitchen and the sounds of cooking activities during the night hours. These reports were generally dismissed as products of overactive imagination influenced by knowledge of recent events. In 1851, the property was purchased by a railroad company that planned to use the land for a new rail line connecting Savannah to Augusta. However, construction was abandoned after workers reported disturbing discoveries buried throughout the property. The official reason given for cancelling the project was soil instability, but private communications suggested other factors had influenced the decision. The case attracted attention from writers and journalists throughout the South, though most accounts focused on sensational aspects rather than factual details. Several books were published that claimed to tell the true story, but these contained significant inaccuracies and fictional elements that obscured the actual events. Academic interest in the case emerged in the 1860s, when researchers at the University of Georgia began studying what they termed aberrant social behavior in isolated communities. However, their findings were never published, and the research materials disappeared from university archives in 1868 during renovations to the library building. The site of the former plantation gradually returned to wilderness as the swamp reclaimed areas that had been cleared for cultivation. By 1870, few visible traces remained of the buildings or agricultural activity that had once characterized the property. Local hunters avoided the area, claiming that game animals would not enter the region. In 1882, a group of archaeology students from Emory University attempted to locate and excavate sites associated with the case. They abandoned their research after preliminary excavations yielded findings that their professor described as inconsistent with accepted historical narratives. The students were reportedly required to sign agreements preventing them from discussing their discoveries. The few surviving witnesses to the original events maintained their silence as they aged. Marcus Whitmore died in San Francisco in 1892 without ever having spoken publicly about his experiences beyond his trial testimony. His widow reported that he suffered from recurring nightmares until his death, always involving sounds and smells associated with cooking. Dr. Hartwell's medical records from the case remained sealed in the Chatham County Courthouse until 1934, when they were transferred to the Georgia Historical Society with restrictions preventing public access. Researchers who have been granted limited access describe the contents as deeply disturbing and challenge conventional understanding of the case. Modern investigations of the area have been hampered by changes to the landscape caused by industrial development and environmental factors. However, occasional discoveries by construction crews and utility workers suggest that evidence of past activities may still be buried throughout the region. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond those directly involved. Several other households in the Savannah area reported experiencing similar problems with domestic staff during the following years, though none reached the extremes documented at the Whitmore plantation. These incidents created a climate of suspicion and fear that persisted for decades. Local folklore developed around the events, creating stories and legends that bore little resemblance to factual accounts. These tales often focused on supernatural elements and divine retribution, reflecting the community's need to process traumatic events through familiar narrative frameworks. The true details remain too disturbing for comfortable discussion in polite society. Church records from the period indicate that several clergymen refused to perform burial services for individuals connected to the case, citing concerns about the spiritual implications of their involvement. Reverend Morrison, who had witnessed the initial investigation, relocated to Virginia in 1848 and never returned to Georgia. The influence of the case extended into legal precedent, with several subsequent trials referencing the evidence collection methods and witness testimony procedures developed during Aurelia's prosecution. However, the specific details were never cited directly, with court documents referring only to the Savannah precedent without elaboration. Property records show that the land changed hands multiple times over the following decades, with each owner abandoning development plans after brief periods of occupation. A pattern emerged of unexplained difficulties that consistently prevented successful utilization of the site for any productive purpose. In 1896, the final surviving member of the original investigating team, Deputy Sheriff William Crawford, provided a deathbed confession to his minister. According to the pastor's private notes, Crawford revealed that evidence had been deliberately concealed during the original investigation because authorities feared the public reaction to complete disclosure. The minister's account, discovered in church archives in 1943, suggested that the true scope of Aurelia's activities had exceeded even the disturbing details presented during the trial. Crawford allegedly described additional sites throughout the region where similar evidence had been found but never officially reported. As the 19th century drew to a close, efforts to document the case became increasingly difficult due to the death of witnesses and the deliberate destruction of sensitive records. Officials who had been involved in the investigation took their detailed knowledge to their graves, leaving only fragmentary accounts for future researchers. The impact on the local community proved lasting and profound. Families who had lived in the area for generations relocated to other regions, unable to reconcile their understanding of human nature with what had been revealed. The social fabric of the community never fully recovered from the revelations about what had occurred in their midst. Modern psychological analysis of the available evidence suggests patterns consistent with what contemporary experts term organized predatory behavior, combined with systematic manipulation of vulnerable individuals. However, the cultural and historical context makes definitive conclusions impossible to establish. The site remains largely undisturbed today, incorporated into a nature preserve that attracts few visitors, despite its proximity to Savannah's tourist attractions. Park rangers report that wildlife populations in the area remain notably sparse, and camping is discouraged due to what officials describe as environmental factors. Occasional attempts by historians and journalists to investigate the case have yielded little new information due to the passage of time and the deliberate concealment of records. The few surviving documents raise more questions than they answer, creating a historical puzzle that may never be completely solved. In the end, the case of Aurelia Thompson stands as a reminder that human behavior can descend to depths that challenge our fundamental assumptions about civilization and morality. The events at Whitmore Plantation demonstrated that even within established social structures, predatory individuals can operate undetected for extended periods when their activities are carefully concealed. The silence that followed the trial reflected not just the passage of time, but a collective desire to forget events too disturbing for comfortable remembrance. Some truths, it seemed, were too horrifying for a community to acknowledge while continuing to function normally. Today, more than a century and a half later, the Spanish moss still hangs from the oaks along the Ogeechee River, and the morning mist still rises from the swamp where Aurelia once conducted her nocturnal activities. But the land remembers what was done there, and perhaps some silences are meant to endure forever. The case files remain sealed. The witnesses are long dead, and the full truth may never be known. But for those who study the darker chapters of human history, the events of 1846 serve as a chilling reminder that evil can wear any face, and the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most helpful and accommodating. The story ends not with resolution, but with the understanding that some chapters of human experience are too dark to be fully illuminated, and perhaps that is as it should be.